Hello everyone. So this video is going to cover on fairy stories, and this is part one. There will be multiple parts. I'm going to chunk this sucker up. But let's begin at the beginning. So this is on fairy stories, which is a lecture that was given by Tolkien, and that he eventually turned into this essay. So he gave it as a speech first, and then transferred it into what you see here. So this is a polished version of his remarks. And he starts off pretty easy, right? He says, I'm going to talk about fairy stories. And I realize that this is a huge thing to undertaking for anyone. And he says at the beginning, he's very humble, right? I have not studied them professionally, he says, but I'm just a wandering explorer or a trespasser, right? I'm full of wonder, but not of information. Except he's about to give you so much information. So he begins by talking a little bit about what happens, right, when you go to fairy. It's a strange new world. It's crazy and perhaps a little bit dangerous. And you don't want to ask too many questions because sometimes that gets you into trouble. But he's going to ask three main questions in this entire lecture or article. The first one is, what are fairy stories? Which is what we're going to cover today in this video. The next part is, what is their origin? And then the last part is, what is the use of them? After that, he's going to get into more stuff. But he starts off by doing what every linguist is going to do, which is he's going to define his terms. So he's like, all right, what is a fairy story? If you go to the OED, right, the Oxford English Dictionary, he says it's very disappointing because it's not even in there, and then it's in the supplement, and it gives you a tale about fairies or a fairy legend with developed senses, an unreal or an incredible story, or a falsehood. So he doesn't like these last two at all, and he's like, all right, but a tale about fairies, I'll take it. Except he says it's actually too narrow, right? Because if you look at what the dictionary definition of fairies is at the time that he's writing this, it says supernatural beings of diminutive size, so small, in popular belief, supposed to possess magical powers and have a great influence for good or evil over the affairs of men. Tolkien is not thrilled with this definition. He doesn't like the word supernatural being applied to fairies, first of all. He says if anything is going to be supernatural, it's going to be people, because fairies are natural, right? Supernatural meaning above or beyond the natural. So he says, well, the fairies are natural. It's the men who are beyond the natural world. So the men are the supernatural, and the fairies are actually natural. So he has problems with the definition from the beginning. And then he gives you, he's like, gotta show off the things. So he says, the road to fairyland isn't the road to heaven, or it's not even the road to hell, but here's that famous passage about the road of hell that, the road to heaven is thorny and hard, and the road to hell is beautiful, right? The path of righteousness is beset with thorns and briars, and after it but few inquires, but the lovely road, that's the path of wickedness. And it's a rough road. Or that's the easy road, appears to be easy, and that's why it's the path to wickedness. Okay. Moving on, but if you look at the other pretty road, he's like, but there's another choice. It's not just the road to heaven or the road to hell. That's the road to fair elfland, which is where, in that story, that's where they end up going, having adventures. Now, he does go on a little bit more about this diminutive size business because that's what Shakespeare's fairies are. They're little tiny fairies, and he says, look, I'm pretty sure this is because England likes small, delicate things. He says, look, if it had gone to France, it probably would have put on powder and diamonds, but we're English, and we like small, dainty things, so I feel like fairies became small and dainty as a reaction to our Englishness. And then he talks a little bit about what happens when you have a great big unexplored world that eventually gets explored. So there is no high Brazil anymore. There's no magical land in the West. There's just Brazil. And all the things that used to be magical or mysterious or impossible or fairy-like are all of a sudden just another continent and another country. It's hard to imagine or to keep that sense of wonder. And then he goes on, he blames Shakespeare and Michael Drayton for making little tiny fairies. And he's pretty clear. Hey, tell us how you really feel, Tolkien. He disliked them as a child. He hates these little mini fairies that hide in flowers and things like that. He says Andrew Lang is also one who agrees with him. Now, Andrew Lang's an important figure because he collects fairy tales and puts them into different colored books. He's got the green book, you know, the red book, the yellow book. The lilac fairy book is what he's referencing here, but he's like, look, I don't like these little fairies, right? They try to be funny and fail, or they try to preach and succeed. So he's not thrilled about little tiny fairy flower sized things. And Tolkien lays it out. He's like, Drayton's Nymphidia is considered as a fairy story one of the worst ever written. He hates this thing. And he describes the Palace of Oberon. Now, Oberon's king of the fairies, and that his palace has walls of spiders' legs and windows of the eyes of cats. As for the roof, instead of slats, is covered with the wings of bats. And then Pigwidgeon rides around on an earwig, and there's a bracelet of Emmet's eyes, and he's like, I hate all of this. That there's still the elements that he enjoys, like the knight and the husband and things like that, but he does not enjoy the delivery. It would have been better if Leith had swallowed the whole affair, he says. So he does not enjoy small fairies. And he continues on by saying, like, look, this is a problem because of a transcription error. The first quotation in the OED, the Oxford Dictionary, is significant because it's from Gower, and it says, as he were a fairy. But that's not what Gower actually says. And for Tolkien, who worked on the OED, he's like, whoever did this translation is, you know, did sloppy work and ruined the definition of fairy forever. But it doesn't say that he were a fairy. It says he were of fairy, and that's an important distinction. He's not a fairy, he's from fairy. And if this is the famous, you know, he's describing this young man who comes as if he were from fairy. He's strange and unusual, and he's got this, you know, this staff, and he's wearing this, there's a circlet of leaves involved, and he's looking at these apparently young women like he's a hawk, and they're foul for him, so they're like, you know, his victims. So you have this very different, strange, otherworldly, presumably beautiful young man who shows up in church and is about to bewitch the young innocent maidens. So that's what the idea of fairy was in Gower, but it got kind of messed up when it made it into the OED, saying that he was a fairy as opposed to just being from fairy, being a man who or a creature from fairy, which is how Tolkien kind of moves on here. He says, look, the issue is not about fairies themselves, it's about men having adventures in fairy. That's really what we care about as readers. And he goes on a little bit more and then says, look, you know, I gotta move on. And so he moves on and he says, look, most good fairy stories are about the adventures of men in the perilous realm. So it's about man going to fairy, having adventures. That's what we hear about. We're not very interested in fairies themselves. We're like, over on Titania, yay, do your thing. Unless you're affecting mankind, we really aren't interested. Moving on, he says, all right, so now if I try to talk about fairy, how do I define that? Like, for fairy, not as a thing, but as a place. So the fairy is the perilous realm. And he says, I can't describe it. In fact, it is indescribable. That's what makes it fairy. But moving on, he says, a fairy story is one which touches on or uses fairy, whatever its main purpose may be. So it can be satire, it can be adventure, it can be morality, it can be fantasy. He has rules, though, Tolkien and his rules. He's like, look, if there is satire, that's fine, but you can't make fun of the magic. You have to take that seriously. And then he gives the example of Gawain and the Green Knight. I say Gawain because my first teacher said Gawain. Other people say Gawain. Either way is fine. Just be consistent. But you may be familiar with that story where he cuts off his head, right? And he's got to find the Green Chapel, and then there's kissing and foxes and deers and rings. Moving on, he says, look, it becomes very clear that people just throw around the tale fairy tale. They're very careless about it, and he means something very specific when he talks about it. So he's going to tell you what is not a fairy tale according to his rules. So he says, look, there are some things that I would get rid of, and I love Andrew Lang, but I don't know why this story is in there. It should not be. And the story he talks about first is Gulliver's Travels, right? The Lilliput story. He says, look, if you ask people to talk about fairy stories, they're going to give you the French stuff, right? Puss in Boots, Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, or Grimm, right? Those count. But A Voyage to Lilliput, which is Gulliver's Travels, right? Jonathan Swift. He's like, this is a travel story and doesn't belong in here at all. It's only in here because the people are small, and again, with that small thing that he hates. So he says, look, travel stories, no, do not belong in fairy tales. They're very different. They have a different purpose. And he puts in like time travel stuff too, like the Eloi and the Morlocks from the Time Machine. He says that's not a fairy story because it's a distance of time and space. And that's not what fairy is about. Now, he does say, here's the thing about fairy. If you are talking about the magic of fairy, like what's the point, what's the purpose? He says one of the things is the satisfaction of a certain primordial human desire. So there's something that humans need, that they enjoy, that fairy delivers on. And one of them is to survey the depths of space and time. This is an important distinction for Tolkien. He says fairy lets you go beyond your own world, beyond your own time, beyond your own spatial limitations, right? You could go elsewhere. And that is one of the things that fairy satisfies in humans. Another thing that fairy tales will satisfy is the desire to hold communion with other living things. Except he has very specific rules. If the other living things are just animals, that's not okay. It needs to be other living human things, which is why he and C.S. Lewis had such a great time being friends, because Narnia is filled with talking animals. So he says those are kind of your things that fairy should accomplish. It should satisfy your desire to survey the depths of space and time, and it should satisfy your desire to hold communion with other living things. Now, after Traveler's Tales, which he's like, nope, don't qualify, he also says dreams. If at the end of your story you're like, it was all a dream, he hates that. He's like, you lied to me, lies, and he gets really mad. He talks about Alice in Wonderland in here. He's like, how could you do this to me? You put me through all of this stuff and all this story, and it was wonderful and magical, and then you're like, oh, but it was all a dream. He thinks that's cheating. It's taking the easy way out, and he's like, nope, not a fairy story. If you tell me that it's a dream, it's not a fairy story. He says that has to be presented as true, and it happened in the context of fairy. And if you present it as a dream, then it's not true. So that, yeah, breaks the rules. Moving on, he has one more thing that he nixes other than the Traveler's Tales and the dreams, and that's the beast fable. He doesn't like it if it's all animals talking. If the animals are stand-ins for humans, he's like, really not enjoying it. And he gives you the monkey's heart, which is a fairly famous story. It's got lots of versions, but smart creature convinces other creature, usually predator, to help it get across a river, and then when it goes to eat it, it's like, oh, but you don't want me, you want my heart. My heart's the best part, but my heart's back in a bag somewhere else. So it's this idea that you keep part of yourself separate from your body so that you can trick a predator into helping you without eating you. And there's lots of slight variations, but it's essentially the same story. And Tolkien doesn't like it because he says, look, you want to hold communion with other living things, but the speech of beasts in a beast fable, as developed in a separate branch, has little reference to that desire, and it wholly forgets it, right? If you're going to have men who understand birds or understand beasts or understand other creatures, he's like, that's one thing, but if you have no humans and you just have animals talking back and forth, he's like, that's not really a fairy story. Fairy story is when humans in fairy suddenly gain the ability to understand animals. That's something else. He only says that because he reads so much Norse mythology, and one of the major tenets and things that always happens is that people fall into blood hits them, they drink blood, some sort of blood thing encounter occurs, and all of a sudden they understand the speech of birds, and the birds are always helping out the humans in the story. They're always like, psst, that dude's about to kill you. Don't die, right? So there are there's like a personal thing happening here for all the Tolkien is like, I just have very firm rules. Yeah, except you love stories that have humans who understand birds, so that's not your issue. Your issue is when there are no humans in the story. But he was really critical of C.S. Lewis because he had talking animals. He was very unhappy about that, unless it's in a Norse story and there's birds. And Tolkien's going to have talking birds, but birds apparently are special and different and don't count when he's talking about this. They don't count as beasts. So it's a little bit of do as I say, not as I do. All right, moving on. After that, he kind of brings to an abrupt halt this section. So he's like, all right, now we're going to move on into Origins, but Origins is going to be the next video.